Hello, and welcome to Real Cheating Story. Week 1, Day 1, Saturday, 8 a.m. I checked my watch again, nerves coiled tight. Then I heard it, the steady thump, thump, thump of running shoes hitting the hard surface of the path. 2 minutes later than last Saturday, but the pattern held true. She came into view around the curve, moving at her usual pace. I watched from my concealed spot behind the leaves, scanning for anyone else nearby. No voices, no dogs, nothing to worry about. Just her jogging alone. I took a deep breath. Time to act or abandon the plan. As my dad would have said, last week I'd been forced to call it off at the last minute when someone walked by with their dog. The week before, a truck had been parked nearby, meaning someone was around. Both times, I stayed hidden and observed, learning the routine. This week, no interruptions. Everything looked good. Time to proceed. I pulled on the ski mask and took out the cloth treated with a harmless sedative mint, quick-acting and safe. As she drew near, I moved swiftly, stepping out from cover to intercept her with precision. Her initial reaction was panic, but the sedative did its job, and she went limp in my arms. I pulled her deeper into the cover of trees and brush. Despite her height, she was relatively light, maybe 120 or 130 pounds. After double-checking to make sure nothing had been left behind, I lifted her and carried her. I shoved the ski mask into my pocket. From a distance, I hoped it would appear as if I was helping someone who had fainted. That was my fallback story, but I intended to avoid any encounters. Eyes and ears sharp, I moved quickly toward my truck. I carefully laid her down behind a bush while scanning the surroundings again. No movement, no one in sight. I secured her wrists with padded cuffs, precautions taken to avoid any injury. Her running gear made it easy to confirm she wasn't carrying anything else. No phone, no GPS device, nothing that could compromise my plans. After one last check to ensure the area was clear, I lifted her into the passenger footwell of the truck, draped a blanket over her, and closed the door. I stood for a moment, listening, watching. Still nothing. The early hour had worked in my favor. No dog walkers, no curious eyes. The morning remained quiet and calm, birds singing in the trees as if nothing unusual had just occurred. I walked over to the nearby trash bin for dog waste. I pulled off one of the plastic poop sacks provided and put the 2 potentially suspect electronic items inside, then sealed them in another bag to disguise the contents. Not that anyone who wasn't under the influence would rummage through a bin full of dog waste in search of valuables. It was only partly full, but it stank. What the heck do they put in some of this dog food? I wanted to be well clear of town before she woke up from the sedative and started screaming. I was away from the parking area and driving along the street before I saw the first dog being walked by its owner. If they'd been 4 minutes earlier out of their house, I'd have had to abort the attempt again. It was possible my truck had been seen parked, but it wasn't distinctive. There are plenty of similar vehicles around town, so I wasn't too worried. It sure seemed like I had gotten away with the abduction so far. The girl came back to life some 10 minutes later while we were still on the road back to my cabin. Of course, as I had feared, she promptly threw up on herself. That's the problem with the sedative, not that chloroform is much better. That stank up the cab, sour and acidic, empty stomach vomit mixed with that cloying chemical smell. It nearly made me heave as well, but I've been exposed to much worse stench in Iraq. I wound down my window to get some fresh air and switched the radio on loud to cover any screams or curses. Not that there were any vehicles near me. Our road is pretty quiet, even at its busiest, especially not yet 8 a.m. on a Saturday. We didn't see a soul. The early risers were already up and away. The other neighbors were most likely still in bed, or maybe sitting out on their porches with their first coffee of the day, thinking about breakfast. Once we got to my turnoff, I got out and very quickly checked my trail on the tracking app before moving on and pulling up in front of the cabin. I pulled the ski mask from my pocket and back over my head, opened the passenger door, and hauled her out onto the ground before unrolling her from the blanket. Geez, she had made a real mess of the blanket, but it had protected much of her lower body. The upper part was in one heck of a state. There was vomit and mucus all over her chest, and her struggles had managed to transfer it to her shoulders, hair, and upper back. She was cursing wildly as she shuffled into a crouching defensive position, glaring hatefully at me. If looks could kill. But I'd had much more visceral receptions from some of the toughest Iraqi detainees, some of whom were said to have committed truly despicable and inhumane crimes that almost beggared belief. So I could look at her calmly, with her hands cuffed in front of her. She could have tried to strike me with a two-fisted blow, but I was counting on her not figuring that one out. I'd figured she would be too helpless with her hands secured behind her back, because I wanted her to be able to drink while cuffed, just in case she didn't see me for a while on my own without backup. I had to be realistic about the risks of getting myself hurt if I had to physically subdue her, although the techniques I'd been trained in were more than effective. Same reason I hadn't hooded her. You really need at least 2 people to guide someone with a bag over their head, one gripping each arm, and somebody else to open and relock the doors. In Iraq, we'd always done it as a squad, which was why we never had any problems, even with the wildest insurgents who struggled to break free as if your touch defiled or burned them. Back in the real world, I bundled up the soiled blanket and put it out of the way on the grass behind me, then waited until she finally paused for breath. I'm going to unlock your hands so you can wash up, dry off, and change clothes. If you try anything, the cuffs go back on, and you'll be stuck in wet clothes for a while. Are you going to cooperate? Screw you, you scum-sucker. You touch me, and I'll make you regret it. I shrugged. Okay, sweetie. If that's how you want to do it, that's your choice. I brought over a bucket of water I had standing ready on the porch and slowly washed the top part of her down. That earned me even more screams and curses but got rid of the worst of the mess from her chest, though it did spread it some. I fetched another blanket, rolled her into it, and carried the struggling, fighting mass into the room that was about to become her cell. I dumped her down on the floor and locked the door behind me, then briefly observed through the spy hole as she wriggled free from the blanket and looked around. Man, she looked pissed. She'd have scratched my eyes out if she could. If I had been anywhere within reach, I would have had to watch her carefully. She was in pretty good condition, and she was definitely angry with me. I pulled off the ski mask and went inside to make myself a coffee. A couple of months earlier, I had finally given in to temptation and bought myself a 12-volt coffee maker. It pulled a hefty 10 amps from the batteries and through my cables, but it was a lot easier than setting up the camping stove and watching the coffee percolate. I usually made only 2 cups worth. The machine kept the jug warm, but there was no point in letting coffee stew. It smelled really good, especially after the sourness of the ether and acidic vomit, and it tasted great too. Then I decided I had earned a second breakfast sandwich. I got the stove going, made myself another one, and settled outside in the morning mid-August sunshine to enjoy it with the second mug of coffee. It was turning into a really nice day. How had I gotten to this point? Months earlier, where I had abducted a young woman and was holding her prisoner in my cabin. Well, it's a long and complicated story, but here goes. Let's say my name is Grant McKinney. That's correct. It's an old family name. I'm of Scottish descent. Our ancestors came over in the 1840s. One of them knew how to build steam engines for pumping water and running machinery, and he saw the potential in a new country. I'm 26 years old, 6 feet 2 inches, and weigh 210 pounds. I work in construction, so most of my weight is muscle and bone. I had thought I was happily married with a really cute 3-year-old daughter, but when I returned from 3 months of National Guard special support duty in the sandbox, I found out I wasn't. I guess the lack of anything at mail call might have given me a clue, but Cassie had never been a great letter writer anyway, so I hadn't expected much. We talked a couple of times the first month I was away, but since then, I hadn't been near enough civilization to call home. I wrote her once a week, but there wasn't much to say. My days were pretty repetitive. The only excitement was when we were under fire. I didn't want her to worry that I was constantly in danger. I wasn't, just sometimes. Days of boredom, a few seconds of terror and excitement that were almost over before the adrenaline kicked in. Little point in pursuing the shooter. They'd be gone with their route or firing point. Maybe a booby trap to check on everyone, then back to the boredom of patrol. A little more cautious for a while, then back to normal levels of suspicion. We tried to keep our minds on the job rather than anything distracting. There was no logic to their insurgency. Our task was to stay alive and reduce their numbers and resources whenever we could. Once my tour of duty was complete, we rotated back from Iraq as planned. No last-minute extension, much to everyone's relief. We were out-processed at Fort Lewis, put on a plane to our local 250-mile military airbase, impressed, fed, and then put on buses for an overnight trip back to our unit armory. We arrived at 6 a.m., stiff from sleeping on bench seats during the long ride home, and, to my surprise, found the cooks from another unit waiting to start breakfast. I signed for receipt of my sealed envelope with the key to my locker, opened it, and pulled out my phone to call home. The battery wasn't quite dead enough to prevent me from seeing that I had no service. I cursed and put it on charge. We cleaned and checked all our equipment, handed it in, ate breakfast, then showered and changed into civilian clothes. I tried to call my wife again, but still had no service. I carried my kit bag over to my truck in the parking lot, gave it a good inspection after all that time sitting there, and headed for home, really glad to be back. I live about 40 miles from the city. Our town is in a valley where the road crosses the river that runs from the wooded hills. It's a beautiful place all year round, lush and green. It looked amazing compared to the hot, dusty, rocky deserts and beaten-up concrete towns I'd been in for the last 3 months. I was going to sit on our porch with my baby girl on my lap, my arm around my wife beside me, just enjoying the clean, sweet-smelling air of home once again, feasting my eyes on the display of flowers and young foliage. Only, I found I no longer had a home or a family. There was a different name on our mailbox, a strange truck in our driveway, and a couple living there whom I didn't know from Adam and Eve. They said they bought the place 6 weeks earlier from a single mom, a Miss Singes, that was Cassie's maiden name. What the hell was going on? When I told them my name, they did recognize it. They had an envelope addressed to Mr. McKinney that the previous owner left in case I called by. I opened it. No explanatory note, just a sheath of legal papers. My ex, may she find peace, had filed for and somehow gotten a divorce on grounds of desertion and had used the power of attorney I had left with her to sell our house. I had naturally assumed, if I had even given it a thought, that there wasn't a court in the land that would consider serving your country as desertion. But it seems one judge, Warren Cornell Grayson, wanted to be the exception that proved the rule. That was the name on the documents that said I was now divorced. The settlement list attached stated that because of my desertion, not responding to the petition for divorce, and being deemed impossible to locate, the family home, savings, property, and all other assets of the marriage were awarded 100% to the wife in lieu of child and marital support. Because there was a minor child involved, the court documents were sealed, and the identity and location of the plaintiffs were not to be revealed. Oh, and just to add to my misery, I was ordered not to approach within 300 feet of my wife and child. Jesus H. Christ, what a stinking mess. I read those papers over 3 times before it all finally sank in. I guess I sat in my truck outside the house that used to be my home for nearly an hour before I recovered enough to go and consult an attorney. He took one look at the papers, confirmed my feeling that I had been taken advantage of, and told me that my only recourse, if I could afford it, was to try to get a federal judge to overturn the whole thing on the grounds that I had been on active service overseas. If I had the money to engage a really smart city lawyer who could handle these things, the potential cost, he gave me a ballpark figure, would be north of $100,000, including gathering evidence, petitioning a higher court to unseal the records, investigation, and legal arguments. And I might not get any of it back even if I won, which wasn't guaranteed. Cassie was the caregiver for Ally, and the courts were almost certain to keep my daughter living with her mother and charge me child support while they were at it. The lawyer said he was really sorry about my situation and advised me to do a lot of thinking before taking any action at all. He even warned me that trying to find out where they were living now would probably lead to an even harsher restraining order, which would severely limit my freedom of movement in a town the size of ours. I thanked him and left his office, heading down the street to my bank, only to find that I didn't have an account there any longer. Geez, she had also taken over the bank accounts and cleaned me out. The guard pay I had earned with my sweat and tears in the sandbox had gone into an account that I now couldn't access. The manager was really sympathetic, but he couldn't refuse a court order that stated none of the money was mine. My name wasn't currently on any accounts, so I had no right to any information about them, even though he had personally received my paycheck to be deposited into that account many times in the past and had greeted me by name whenever he saw me. He was apologetic, but there was nothing he could do for me. I drove the 40 miles straight back to the armory, luckily finding the admin staff still there, finishing up the last of the paperwork. I showed my envelope and its contents to the payroll guy, explained what had happened at the bank, and he was able to cancel my final direct deposit payment and arrange to hold it until I opened a new account. That night, I slept in my truck. I'd had much worse beds recently. Steel armor plate has absolutely no give in it. And although my truck was pretty beaten up, the seat upholstery was better than that. The next morning, I went and got myself a new account at a different bank and took the details back to the armory. I was able to get a hardship payment in cash, and I still had a little left in my wallet from our last field payment. I wasn't going to starve this week. I was just so glad I hadn't wasted my cash on gadgets at the Fort Lewis PX. 3 months in the sandbox, and 2/3 of my pay had been stolen from me. Thanks a lot, Uncle Sam. I had just one secret I'd kept from my wife, and that was only because I wanted to give her a really nice surprise to show how much I loved her. I'd been scrimping and saving to buy us a 5th anniversary gift. Just under a year earlier, I'd found a rundown cabin on a quarter section of woodland to be our weekend and vacation place while the kids grew up. I got it for pretty much just the back taxes, and my boss had let me take waste and surplus construction materials that would have otherwise been dumped to help me make the place livable again. To keep it a surprise, the deeds had been in my locker back at the armory, along with my truck papers, so she hadn't been able to get her thieving hands on them, or at least, I hoped not, or they'd have been gone too. Next up was going to see my boss, Harry Hamilton, to check that he was following the law and had kept my job open for me. Yeah, he definitely had, and he welcomed me back as if he'd really missed me. That was some good news at last. I asked him if he could spare me some uninterrupted time later, and he suggested I come back at 6, when everyone else would have left. I drove over to the cabin to check that it was still there. Knowing my current run of luck, it had probably been taken over by a gang of moonshiners, criminal bikers, or drug traffickers, so I approached the final stretch very cautiously. I almost missed the entrance, it was so well hidden now. 3 months of undisturbed growth meant the driveway was more than 3 feet high in grass and weeds. I guessed from the lack of tracks that no one had been near the place since I closed it up. After checking on foot that the entrance was clear of any hidden obstacles, I couldn't afford to damage my truck on a dumped fridge or something. I climbed back in and cautiously headed up the drive. Mother Nature had clearly had a field day in my absence. A domestic weed whacker would never have touched the new growth, not without buying a whole case of cutting cord. Still, I had a plain old-fashioned scythe somewhere in the barn, and that would at least get me started without costing me anything but time and effort. I'd done it before when I first bought the property, so I guessed I could do it again. Honest toil and sweat in my own place would beat heat-related sweat in the sandbox any day of the week. The cabin was there and seemingly intact. It smelled pretty stale after being closed up so long. I propped the door wide open and took down the storm shutters over the 2 small windows to let some air circulate, then took a good look around. There was no damp or critter damage, and I gave myself a pat on the back for having left the place weathertight. The barn was fine too. I forced a path through the weeds down to the creek and the small swimming hole. I had plans to improve that so our kids would have a safe place to enjoy the cool water in the heat of summer. As it looked like I no longer had a daughter, that idea was as dead as my marriage. I sat there for a while in peace and solitude. I guess my situation hadn't really sunk in yet. I was still in the survival mode we'd gotten into in the sandbox. Did I want to try to save my marriage? Hell no. A woman who could do that to her guy was no woman for me. Did I want to have my daughter back? Yes. But could I pay the price? Could I find her? The way my ex had behaved told me there was no way on God's little green earth she'd play fair. Seeing Ally was probably kinder on the girl to let her go and forget my existence. Yeah, she was my blood and my little love, but I couldn't give her the home she deserved. Wanting isn't always the sign of a wise decision. Geez, what a screw-up to start with. I looked at my watch and saw it was already 5. I trotted back to my truck and headed for my appointment with my boss. He was just finishing signing the timesheets at the end of the day and asked for 10 minutes to enter the job labor cost data. I sat on the wall outside his office until he came out to find me. Okay, Grant, what did you need to talk about? About us, I said. We went into his office, grabbed a coffee each, and sat down. He listened in horrified silence until I got to the bit about Judge Warren Cornell Grayson. He asked to look at the papers and was shaking his head in dismay as he leafed through them. Grant, you really want to watch yourself here. This reads as if the judge thinks you're a deadbeat dad who deserted his family and should be in jail. That scumbag is old school, and I don't think he's ever changed his mind in his life. You'll be really lucky to find a lawyer in this town willing to tell him he was wrong. And then, if you interrupt or move a muscle in his court, you'll be in jail for 30 days at a time for contempt. Darn it, it almost reads as if he'd have happily given you 30 days just to start with if you'd been there. That's what I pretty much figured out. Cassie has totally screwed me. No judge in his right mind would have signed off on that plea, but this scumbag has done just that. He's hardly going to give me a fair hearing. 2 months later, huh? The chances of having some time with your daughter don't look good either, not when there's no contact information. I'm also 100% sure your ex will do everything she can to make it as difficult as possible. I really miss Ally, but having to play nice with her to see her? No way. Harry sighed. It's really tough, son. But for what it's worth, I think you're making the right decision. I know it stinks, but at the moment, there isn't much we can do about it. I'll keep listening. But for everyone's sake, don't start asking questions. Grayson will hear about it and want to know why you're discussing a sealed case. It's a surprisingly small town. Still, you might be able to do something about your daughter eventually. But watch your back every time you even mention her name out loud. He sealed the records, so that's a straight contempt. There's got to be some reason the split is so final. Either someone was hoping you wouldn't be coming back except in a box, or someone the judge owes wanted your wife. That's going to take some thinking about. I thanked him for his honesty and support and said I'd report for work in the morning. He was pleased with that and told me where to be. I got myself a cheap evening meal, drove to my remaining property, and slept in the truck cab again. I'd kept a couple of old blankets in the cabin. They needed some time in the sun and fresh air before the stale smell would go away. I was awake at dawn and headed into town for some breakfast before work. It was good to be back with the crew. They had been with and around me for a few years but had never known me well enough to be fully informed about my home life. I'd always said when they asked if I wanted to go drinking with them on payday evening that I had a young kid, and she came first. Okay, some of them called me a wimp and said a couple of drinks wouldn't hurt, but I stayed firm, and they stopped bothering me about it. They were much more interested now in what life had been like in the sandbox and how many ragheads I'd wasted, 0 confirmed, which disappointed some of them. None of them had any idea my wife was now my ex, and I didn't enlighten them. I got right back into the swing of things. We were busy, and there was more work in the pipeline once this site was finished, so none of us were hurting for things to do. I hadn't lost my knack, and by lunchtime, you wouldn't have known I'd been away from the job. Harry Hamilton asked for another word that night when I stopped by the office. Grant, I've been thinking more about your problem with Grayson. He's got you tagged as a deadbeat dad who ran out on his wife and child. Yeah, I know that's absolutely not the case, but judging from his ruling, that's exactly what he'll be thinking. I reckon if you keep your head down and your nose clean, you'll be okay. But if you end up in his court for any reason, and he connects the dots, he'll gut you and spit out the bones. He's got a thing about people he considers deadbeats. Heck, there's more than one family in town with a son in the services rather than in jail because of him. Thanks, man. My advice? Be extra cautious for a while until we get a better feel for what's happening. So, no drinking and driving. Keep your truck legally roadworthy. No traffic violations or speeding. Get yourself a burner phone and think about changing your appearance a little, just so your ex doesn't suddenly spot you around town and decide to cause you more trouble, like swearing out a restraining order for something you haven't done. How about growing a beard? I chuckled. Drinking was an unnecessary expense I couldn't afford now, and losing my driver's license wasn't an option either. The beard was a no-go as far as the guard was concerned, but I guessed I could look scruffy and unkempt between training sessions. Cassie hadn't liked facial hair, so she only knew me clean-shaven. My phone was the first thing that didn't work. I guess when the payment stopped, the contract got pulled. I'll buy a cheap burner until I earn enough to set up with another provider. The rest of what you say makes sense, so I guess I'll lie low for a while. The beard will have to come and go depending on when there's a guard drill weekend, but it makes sense not to be instantly recognized. Good decision. If there's anything I can help with, let me know. I thought for a minute. If my phone contract had dropped out, then anything else connected to my old bank probably had too. Boss, I'm going to need to see my insurance broker and check if the DMV has me listed as behind on plates. I guess the internet account and utility bills don't matter anymore, but I think my credit rating's probably taken a hit. Talk to your new bank manager. Warn him there's a possibility of identity theft. If he gets funny about it, tell him to give me a call and I'll vouch for you. Thanks, boss. That's another one I owe you. He had advanced me some cash against my future wages, which was pretty good of him, so I could buy fuel and eat until payday. I camped at the cabin that week, getting one hot meal a day at a small mom-and-pop diner before going home to sleep in the truck parked by my cabin. Heck, where else could I have gone? It was okay as a temporary measure, great when rated on price, but I had sure compiled a long list of necessary improvements. By my second wake up there since I'd been activated to go to Iraq, I'd been working on the cabin some evenings and weekends, but always going home at night. So other than the blankets and some containers, I had no household stuff at all in the cabin. Heck, apart from my kit bag and the sports bag that had been in my armory locker, I had no household belongings or clothing at all. Hamilton Construction supplied some of the necessary protective clothing as a company uniform and to keep safety inspectors off my back, so I was okay for boots, cargo trousers, and a heavy coat. But everything else, I need to buy. Saturday morning, after I talked to the bank, I took a trip down to the Goodwill store and picked up a few things: jeans, shirts, sneakers, a couple of plates, and some silverware, all used but clean. There was a pawn shop a few doors down, and I wandered in to see if there was anything larger worth having, like a commercial weed whacker at a knockdown price or maybe a second-hand shotgun to get myself the odd free bit of tasty protein out of my woods. I took a closer look at what was behind the glass. That shotgun with the distinctive chunk out of the fore end had been my dad's. My own guns were in the cabinet right in front of me. I had paused, cursing, when the guy behind the counter offered me a coffee and asked to hear the story. Guess it was a real quiet day for him. I lucked out in a way. He'd been burned by a divorce as well, and although he said he couldn't afford to take a loss on the guns, he offered to show me his books so I could see what he paid. He told me that when the tickets expired in a few weeks, he'd let me have first refusal at cost plus 10%. That was more than decent of him, better than his coffee, but I didn't tell him that bit. He got out the books so I could have a look. Now that was interesting. She pawned them and a number of other things of mine under her mother's maiden name but with her old address. Looks like she had no intention of being tracked down from that. The guy chuckled when he heard that. He reckoned his suspicions about the deal had proved right, which was why he'd only given well below book value. We shook on our agreement. I took one of his business cards and said I'd be back. Okay, I was going to have to pay for something that was mine in the first place, but at least I was getting them back, not having to start new. Next up was the town dump. You'd be amazed at what some folks just throw away. Okay, maybe you wouldn't. I was known there. I'd gotten some nearly new tin sheeting for the barn roof just before I left, and the two guys who ran it let me walk through their open barn to see what else they'd salvaged. There was a small 2-burner propane Coleman camping stove that someone had dumped. They let me have it for $1. The rust on the side of the heat shield made it otherwise unsaleable. It didn't take me more than a few minutes with some fine emery cloth to clean it up for use. It was easy enough to buy a tank of propane and a new connecting hose. I had my basic cooking equipment. I had looked at the Coleman propane lanterns while I was in the camping store, but I reckoned they would throw off too much heat in the summer and attract night-flying insects. So I'd be better off going to bed with the sun and buying one of those LED flashlights or headlamps if I needed to be about at night until I sorted something better. Now that I was actually going to be living in the cabin, there were 4 essential needs I hadn't had when it was just going to be a weekend hideaway: lighting, refrigeration, sanitation, and drinking water. There was no way I could afford to get connected to the electricity grid, so I asked the dump guys what they knew about off-grid living. Not much, but they had some books and pamphlets that people had dumped. I borrowed a couple and did some reading. That helped me use up the evenings after work, and I learned a whole lot. Seems the key is to minimize your load. LED lights, low power consumption goods, nothing wasteful. I read in one of the articles that the average power drain in standby mode in an American home is more than most off-grid battery systems can supply. I don't know how true that is, but if you think about it, nearly every appliance now has a clock, a backlit control panel, and a standby mode. It all adds up. I asked around at work if anyone had ever done anything off-grid. One of the electricians had, so I bought him a couple of beers and picked his brain. He gave me a lot to think about. A 12-volt DC system running off a bank of batteries and recharging from a solar panel and a small wind turbine was perfectly feasible as long as I was sensible about what I tried to run on it. If necessary, I could use a generator to charge up the batteries, but it was easy enough to design a self-contained system if I didn't get greedy for power. Refrigeration was always going to be a problem off-grid. Yeah, there were options with kerosene and propane, but they were too expensive for me at the moment. A source of purified drinking water was also possible with some investment, but the cheapest short-term option was to buy bottled water for cooking and drinking and use the creek water for washing. Sanitation needed to be tackled before it became an issue, especially finding a solution that wouldn't risk contaminating the creek water. In Iraq, I learned a lot about sanitation. The public infrastructure had already long broken down, and it was mostly about doing whatever you could to avoid contact with local bacteria. So I knew what wasn't acceptable. Of course, there were local construction codes to help me. I needed to construct some kind of outhouse with a tank or leach field. Digging a hole every time I needed to go had been fine for odd weekends, but shovel patrol wasn't going to be an option living there full-time. It was something I'd have to tackle anyway. Before showing the plan to Ally and Cassie, I couldn't have made them squat over a pit in the yard. I talked to Harry Hamilton. He nodded sagely when I explained my problem. He really was a great guy who helped me out again. You've got a hitch on your truck. Why don't you take the trailer and the small digger home with you on weekends? Let me know how much diesel you use, and I'll deduct it from your wages before taxes. That was a real kind offer. It would save me a bundle of cash and a whole lot of time and physical labor. I can handle a shovel with the best of them when it's necessary, but this was digging just for digging's sake, a waste of my time. I borrowed the necessary code books from him and marked out the distances at home that evening. Yeah, that could work. The problem was going to be piping the water for flushing waste into a tank. I skimmed through the codes. It was possible to dig a pit like an old-fashioned privy with a drain to a leach field for liquids and use sawdust to compost the waste and reduce the smell. If I made the pit big enough from the start, it would be years before I'd have to dig it out and empty it. Next Saturday, my available funds replenished by a week's work, I made another trip to the dump. The guys had remembered my request for a bed and put a couple aside for me once again. I was amazed that someone could afford to ditch a nearly new king-size bed with a mattress that was only a little stained from a soda spill. I got it at a very reasonable price, which still left me with some cash in hand. While I was in town stocking up on supplies, I also hit the Goodwill store. I decided that drinking out of aluminum or plastic was slumming it, so I found some coffee mugs and beer glasses for a couple of bucks. The lady kindly wrapped them carefully in sheets of old newspaper inside a cardboard carton, and I put the carton in the passenger footwell to keep it safe. Okay, I'd never need a matching set of 4 mugs, but I felt it was progress on my way to getting my life back together. That afternoon, I unpacked the mugs and glasses and smoothed out the sheets of newsprint to save for kindling come winter, when a name jumped right out of the page and hit me in the eye. Yep, you guessed it, none other than Judge Warren Cornell Grayson. Well, I read the article and then read it again. It was a puff piece about a charity event that had happened in town while I was away. They'd held a formal dinner and dance to raise money for the repair of the oldest building in town, which now houses our local museum. All the town's notables were there in support. The many photographs illustrating the article included one showing the pompous guy in question standing all decked out in his tuxedo for the photographer with his wife and daughter, also dressed in their jewels and finery. Their smug faces pretending they didn't stink. That small-town newspaper photo was the reason why, 6 months after it was taken and published, and 4 months after I had returned home, Laura Cornell Grayson, age 20, a college pre-law sophomore and the only child of Judge Warren Cornell Grayson and his wife, was now locked in my cabin. You know the saying, don't get mad, get even. It had been a really busy time since I'd come across that article and gotten the idea of kidnapping her for ransom. What with intending to have myself a reluctant visitor to stay there had been a whole lot of extra work needed on the cabin beyond what was necessary for a bachelor pad, which was why it had taken that long for me to be ready to keep her captive. That reminded me, I couldn't just sit around all day patting myself on the back for how hard I'd worked to make that cabin habitable and pretty near escape-proof. I had myself a guest to look after. Time to play the caring host. Not week 1, day 1 continued. I finished my coffee, returned indoors, and looked through the spy hole on the door. Miss Grayson was clearly still not at all happy with the standard of accommodation on offer and seemed to be voicing her poor opinion of me quite freely. She didn't seem to have taken to me one little bit. I could pretty much hear what she was shouting through the door, and the volume got a lot louder when I donned the ski mask and cracked the door open. Oh boy, seemed I'd gotten it all wrong. She wasn't complaining about the lack of a view or the rudeness of the staff. She wasn't demanding an upgrade to an en-suite bathroom or a suite or a bigger bed. It was simply a case that she didn't want to stay at my hotel at all. That was hard to believe. It wasn't like she was paying for the window or carpet or bed or minibar or bathroom she didn't have. It was a much nicer place to be than some of the concrete structures I'd crashed down and over in Iraq. I supposed it compared unfavorably to her richly furnished girly bedroom at home. I grinned. Well, tough, sweetie. I didn't want to get divorced. I didn't want to lose my darling daughter. I didn't want to lose my home. Life's a mess, and then you marry one. Sometimes you get stuck with someone else's bills. She was stuck with paying off her father's dues, and there wasn't anything she could do to change that. That girl could curse. There had been a couple of ladies I'd come across in the service who tried the wrong way to show they were just as tough as the men, and their grasp of bad language wasn't nearly as creative as hers. Some repetition, but not bad enough to be marked down on. I almost considered asking her if she was majoring in Anglo-Saxon, but I didn't want to raise the topic of her new semester. She didn't yet need to know she wouldn't be going back to college for a while. I opened the door carefully and stepped around the soaked, filthy blanket on the floor. The drenched woman lunged at me, something I expected. I'd already decided I wouldn't play nice until she did. A firm hand pressed on her shoulder pushed her back down on the floor. With the cuffs still on, she wasn't getting up quickly. The surprise of being pushed down kept her quiet for a few seconds before she started yelling again. So I shouted back, "Enough. Are you going to cooperate and stay still while I remove the cuffs?" I asked. "Forget you, jerk," she snapped, shrugging defiantly to show she wasn't bothered. This was my home, and I was going to handle things my way. Fine. If you'd rather stay cold, wet, and miserable, that's your choice. I've got all the time in the world. She started yelling obscenities again. If she didn't ease up soon, she was going to have a sore throat from shouting. There was certainly nothing wrong with her lung capacity. Her weekly runs were keeping her in good shape. If it had been me, I'd have wanted to rinse the taste of acid and early morning, empty stomach sickness out of my mouth as soon as possible. Though judging by the amount of spit flying with the curses, she'd probably expelled most of it already. I pulled an unopened bottle of water from my pocket and set it on the floor, then picked up the discarded blanket. I backed out of the door and locked it again. Taking off my mask, I carried both blankets down to the swimming hole to rinse them thoroughly in the creek. I also brought back a bucket of clean water to replace the one I'd used to wash her down. I hung the blankets over the tailgate of my truck. It was warm enough that they'd dry quickly. Then I made myself another coffee and spent a couple of hours working on my latest assignment for my online associate degree in construction management. That degree had been another major life change since spring, when Harry Hamilton promoted me to run the team. He'd sat me down to discuss my future, telling me I'd always been one of his more reliable workers. My guard service had matured me beyond my years, and if I got qualified, he could see me becoming his general manager someday. I agreed. I didn't want to spend my life hauling sheetrock for a weekly wage, and I was ready to get some book learning. We talked about study courses, and he advanced me the money for tuition up front, deducting it from my wages at only $100 a month, which I thought was fair. Without a mortgage or family expenses, I could now save some decent money each month. I'd also taken care to pay the cabin's property taxes well ahead of the deadline to make sure it stayed mine. I really lucked out the day I wandered into that pawn shop. She dumped most of my valuable personal items there, eager to squeeze the last possible cent out of my stuff. If she'd taken it all to the dump, I'd never have seen any of it again. But I now had my toolbox, a few power tools, my guns safely locked away, and my computer back. Everything the pawn shop had on the guy's books from her was back in my possession. No clothes, no personal items, no household stuff, but most of that could be replaced. I was upset that I had no mementos of my folks except Dad's shotgun, but there wasn't much I could do besides keep my eyes open. I'd have loved to find my grandfather's rocking chair, but I figured some collector must have offered cash for that and the other furniture. I'd keep looking. I didn't have grid electricity in the cabin, but Mr. Hamilton had kindly invited me to keep my computer at the office for study purposes, so I could access old photos, documents, and manage my bank account online. I was only doing the mandatory duty time with the Guard before our short support rotation in Iraq. I'd volunteered for almost anything to improve my skills and military knowledge. Heck, I'd even taken some online courses on my own time. Reluctant to admit to friends and comrades that my marriage had crashed spectacularly, I deliberately downplayed my involvement. Our company first sergeant noticed I was around less often and pulled me aside to ask what had changed. I only told him part of the truth, that my regular work responsibilities had increased. That wasn't uncommon, so he accepted the excuse. He was a great guy, and I felt bad not being completely honest, but at the time, I wasn't in any mental state to open up fully. With hindsight, that secrecy was a huge mistake. What was an intensely personal disaster to me was just routine, minor problems for the Army. They had helped many service members through what I was going through and would have helped me too if I'd let them. Of course, my life would have been very different if the Army had summoned the judge to federal court and threatened him with imprisonment if he didn't overturn his flawed decision. I wouldn't have had to break the law by kidnapping his daughter, but I didn't know that then. Harry Hamilton was the only one who knew the truth about my divorce. Heck, I even kept Cassie and Ally as my next of kin for the service's records. Who else was there? I'd even thought about resigning from the Guard to avoid facing my comrades as a failed husband and father. But being a citizen soldier still meant something to me. Maybe, once this episode of revenge against Judge Warren Cornell Grayson was over and I had closure, I'd return to my old level of commitment, work permitting. I reached a good stopping point in my studies, set down my pen, and looked through the spy hole at my captive. She'd finally worn herself out from shouting and was now huddled against the far wall, looking exhausted, a stark contrast to the polished woman in the newspaper photo. Back then, she'd been dressed in an elegant evening gown, diamonds gleaming from her ears, hair neatly styled and shining. Now she wore running shorts and a sweatshirt, both soaked and stained. Her hair was damp, tangled, and a complete mess. The cabin, shaded by surrounding trees and well-insulated, remained cool. She must have been feeling the chill by now. I pulled on my ski mask, picked up the bucket of water, a washcloth, and a towel. I opened the door and was met with a glare that could have blasted me if looks could kill. I'd seen similar expressions on some of the tough insurgents we'd held. I didn't speak, just dropped the washing kit on the floor and backed out of the room. She could clean up some, but with the handcuffs still on, it wouldn't be easy. Not really my problem, she'd come around in time. The water bottle I'd given her earlier was empty. I guess she'd used some to rinse her mouth, then drank the rest. She'd survive until I gave her another. I took a slow stroll around my property. It was quiet and peaceful, and I remembered again exactly why I bought this place, as a refuge from the noise, smells, and traffic of town. The new bridge over the river had brought prosperity, turning a few shacks into a proper town. But the downside was the constant traffic of commercial vehicles. There was nothing overhead but the occasional aircraft way above. I was sure Ally would have grown to love this place as much as I did. Cassie, maybe not so much. She still liked to party and go out at night, forgetting she had a child now. I wondered for a moment how they were doing. I hoped Ally was healthy and happy. If Cassie had really gone off the rails, she wouldn't be getting the love and attention I'd always tried to give her. I went back to the cabin, locked and barred the outer door, and checked the spy hole to see my captive again. She looked a little cleaner, at least. She'd used the washcloth to get the last traces of snot and vomit off her face. I checked where the bucket was and decided it was safe to enter the room. I pulled on the ski mask and unlocked the door, oiling the lock and hinges so they moved silently. That had been a smart move. I was inside and fully aware of my surroundings before she even knew I was there. I grabbed the bucket and got it safely out of the way before I spoke. Miss Grayson, the offer to take the handcuffs off is still open. If you agree, I'll bring you some food and drink. Why don't you just take me home, huh? She snapped. Have you any idea exactly who my father is? She said. He's the county judge, that's who. You couldn't have picked a worse person to tangle with. He's not going to permit any plea deal, not with his only child. You've abducted me, which is a major felony. That means the rest of your miserable life in federal prison. You won't like that. It's going to be rough for you. I grinned at her words. At least she'd started thinking about her situation, probably realizing that if I just wanted to hurt her, I would have done it by now. You're forgetting two important things, sweetie. 1, the sentence for murder isn't a whole lot higher than for kidnapping. And 2, if I just killed you and buried you out in the woods, no one would ever find you or me. She peered a bit at the word murder, but I'd give her credit. She didn't look or sound particularly scared, just irritated. I'm not your sweetie. You're wasting our time. Take me back home right now. You're a complete screw-up, and you have no idea the world of trouble you've just gotten yourself into. A wimp like you isn't going to last long in jail. With your whining attitude, someone will stick a shiv into your kidneys before you even get to trial. You'll either die screaming or spend the rest of your life in a wheelchair. And I'll laugh my butt off when I hear the news. I grinned again. She had quite the imagination. Okay, sweetie, dream on. If you don't want to change out of your wet clothes, that's your choice. I just hope they aren't chafing your skin too much. Now, I want to get you out of here just as much as you want to be home. How about we write the ransom note to your father and get this process started? She hissed in anger. Screw off, needle tool. Just screw off. Okay, sweetie. No skin off my nose. Be seeing you. That was noon. I did another hour on my assignment, then fixed myself some pre-packed sausage with slow-cooked lentils for lunch. I'd eaten worse, a lot worse. Like that week when the supplies sergeant didn't check the labels on the MREs, and we had the same menu for 8 straight days. I'd never look at spicy penne pasta again without feeling nauseous. Hell, the smell alone would be enough to set me off. Note, I use the word smell. I reserve aroma for food or drink. Spicy penne pasta didn't fit those categories in my view. It was more like fuel or maybe chemical warfare. Most of our company felt the same. There was the odd weirdo who claimed to still actually enjoy eating MREs, but as they say, you can't fix stupid. One of the old-timers had joked that Uncle Sam's taste was actually improving. He said it was gourmet compared to the old ham omelet or chicken tetrazzini. If he was speaking the truth, then you had to question his sanity and his decision to re-up so many times. Just before 2. I pulled on the mask and entered the room again. Thought any more, Miss Grayson? Yes. Screw right off, you jerk. Okay, sweetie. At least you're consistent. Missing you already. There was another outraged squeal of protest as I backed out of the doorway, locked up, and left her alone for a couple more hours. I intended to leave her alone, but after an hour of sitting on my porch enjoying the quiet, I decided to check if she'd changed her mind. I didn't want her making herself sick out of sheer stubbornness. That's why I'd given her some water free of charge. Anything else would require her to speak to me. I figured her wet clothes were already causing discomfort, and the last thing I wanted was for her to get sick. For her own well-being, she needed to stay healthy while she was stuck here. I expected her to lash out again, but exhaustion, hunger, and the discomfort of dirty, damp clothes had worn down her attitude, just as I suspected they eventually would. Her glare was sharp, but her words were quiet and resigned. I need something more to drink. I decided not to yank her chain by calling her sweetie again. She was being polite for now. Okay, Miss Grayson, I'll get you some bottles of water. You could have had them 6 hours ago, you know. All you had to do was ask. She somehow managed to hold back a retort, but her eyes flashed dangerously. Yeah, she had a fair point. If I hadn't kidnapped her in the first place, 6 hours ago, she'd have been back home by now, her run completed, in her own bedroom, having a hot shower before breakfast, looking forward to the weekend ahead. Life can be a real pain sometimes, you know? The next bottle of water was ready and waiting just outside the door. I backed away from her, picked it up by feel, and rolled it toward her. She shuffled over and clumsily picked it up with both hands, fumbling to break the seal and open the cap. She took a short sip, swirled it around her mouth, spat it onto the floor, then drank thirstily. She looked up at me expectantly. I wasn't going to mistreat her just for the sake of it, and I needed to make her aware of that fact. Handcuffs off. Maybe something to eat? You've got to be really hungry by now. No breakfast, no lunch. She sighed, seemingly accepting defeat. Yeah, I won't fight. I was pretty certain, in fact, that she wasn't nearly defeated. But logic had won out, and she knew she needed food, water, and to get clean and dry, or she'd get sick. Like the detainees at the holding center, she'd worked out that her guard was the only person who could get her those things, so some bending was needed. She'd folded quite quickly. So I knew she could just be bluffing, pretending to cooperate so she might get the chance to turn the tables on me. Our instructors had been real clear on that point. You could never trust a prisoner. Never. They'd try to lull you into a false sense of security, then strike at the slightest sign of weakness or distraction. They weren't going anywhere, so they developed infinite patience. I could never let my guard down, not even for a minute. Apparently, Stockholm Syndrome works both ways. The guard develops sympathy for the prisoner. That's kind of dangerous. This girl might not want to chop my head off with a huge sword like the insurgents did in Iraq, but she could accidentally do me a lot of damage. I just had to ensure I never gave her the opportunity. I was glad they'd given us such thorough training in prisoner restraint techniques. Okay, so she was probably only half my body weight, but she wasn't short. She ran and worked out. She might even have taken some self-defense classes in college, so she could possibly know how best to hurt or incapacitate me. I certainly wouldn't want to have to subdue her from a surprise attack. She could probably hurt me if she landed a lucky blow. She might even get out of this room and into the cabin, which was why I barred the outer door and locked my own bedroom with anything that could be an effective weapon safely secured inside. Any contact with her carried some risk. I just had to stay on my toes and think before acting. I'd bet my last dime that, given the right opportunity, she could be wilder than a boar in a peach orchard, like her daddy would be if he ever got hold of me in person in his courtroom. Okay, stay right there. I'll be back shortly. I locked the door, gathered the supplies I had prepared, and added a tube of soothing skin cream. Working construction in wet weather often causes abrasions and chafing. I checked the peephole again and unlocked the door. Stay exactly where you are. Don't move a muscle. Keeping a close eye on her, I placed the items on the floor against the wall. Another bucket of water, soap, a towel, a toothbrush, and a comb. Sweat top and pants. I guess they might be a little large. 2 more bottles of water, 2 packs of sandwiches, and a banana. Try not to bolt the food on an empty stomach. Eat and drink slowly. Supper will be in 5 hours. See that bench in the corner? Lift the lid. It's a commode over a composting pit. It doesn't flush, so keep the lid closed and it won't stink. You can pour the waste water down it when you finish washing. I'll be back in an hour, and I'll knock on the door before I open it. Clear. She scowled. Yeah, handcuffs. Kneel down facing the wall, hands above your head. Remember, don't mess with me, or they go back on tighter, and you won't like being restrained that way. She wordlessly assumed the position. I stepped to one side, just as I'd been trained, so she couldn't elbow me or throw herself backward at me. I unlocked and pulled off the cuffs, then quickly moved back toward the doorway. She was rubbing her wrists, quietly cursing me. I closed and locked the door, sneaking a glance through the peephole as she changed out of her muddy, soaked clothes. Yeah, I did. Even in her exhausted state, she looked far more genuine than anyone I'd seen overseas. Maybe it was because she looked natural, without the artificial polish so many try to perfect. I guess she was around 5 feet 9 inches or 5 feet 10 inches with a fit, athletic build that suggested she worked out regularly. Her physique was well-toned, and there were faint signs of irritation under her skin, likely from a damp sports bra. Her complexion was smooth, slightly tanned, and her legs were long and well-proportioned. If you want something more specific or a different tone, just let me know. Yeah, real easy on the eyes. Damn, I should have set up some kind of spy cam in that room. Reluctantly, I pulled my attention away from the peephole, gave her the full hour of privacy, and then knocked loudly on the door before cracking it open. You decent in there? I asked. In the area? None were skimpier clothing, she shot back. I pushed open the door. She looked like she was wearing 2 large sacks. Heck, she could have been a guy, and you'd never have known from her figure in that outfit. Her eyes were blazing, and it was just as well she couldn't see quite how awful she looked now. I managed not to laugh. Even I could tell it wouldn't be smart to upset her any further. My bad, I'm a lot heavier than you. I'll get you something less baggy. Height and size, screw you, she snapped. I guessed your size last time, sweetie. I got it badly wrong. Do you really want me to have to guess again? She growled. 5 feet 10 inches, size 6, B cup size, she said, glaring. You really are a twisted little perv, aren't you, dinky tool? I exhaled loudly to show her she was being pretty dumb about this. Do you want to be comfortable or not? That sports bra isn't going to be ideal for everyday use. I bet it chafed you today. You're going to want to wash it occasionally, so you need a spare. You can either go braless or not. That's your choice. She looked surprised, as if a mere man shouldn't know the difference between a sports bra and an everyday one. Then her eyes narrowed again. Okay, it's size 34B. Why don't you go buy 2 of them? Then you can keep one too, you know. I chuckled, pulling her chain again. That's almost tempting, sweetie, but nah. I've never put on a bra for anything less than 44DD. Now those were humongous. I came close to losing it. She wasn't used to crude humor like that. I decided to quit while I was ahead and struck a conciliatory note. Thank you, Miss Grayson. I'll get on that in the morning. I'm not trying to humiliate you over clothing, honestly. That was all I had. I messed up on estimating your size, and I'm sorry for the error. That threw her off balance as intended. A kidnapper apologizing? Her tone became quieter, more conversational. She'd recognized the change and responded to it. I guessed correctly. This girl was not only attractive but smart. I'd have to remember she wasn't the society airhead she'd appeared to be in that newspaper photo. Why don't you just let me go home right now and save yourself all the trouble and risk of a trip to the store to buy female clothing? I smiled beneath my ski mask. There hadn't been a single bad word in that sentence, and it almost sounded reasonable. That's what I want to work on next, getting you home safely as soon as possible. Trouble is, it's going to cost your folks something to get you back, so it's going to take some time. I want you to be comfortable while you're my guest. She snorted. Guest? That's a pile of steaming nonsense. You've committed a crime, a federal felony, abducting me, and now you're making it worse by keeping me. Don't try to let yourself off lightly. I'm your victim, and you're the criminal. Why don't you take me back home right now and leave it at that? I grinned. Yeah, whatever. What's going to happen is that you're going to record a message to your father and write him a note. He can get the ransom cash together. I'll pick it up, and then you can go home. Simple. As expected, she didn't like that answer, not one bit. Listen to me for once, you dumb SH, she started, but I cut her off mentally. You let me go right now, and we'll call this quits. I haven't seen your ugly face, and I have no idea where this godforsaken place is. Just drop me home, and maybe, just maybe, you have a slim chance of getting away with this. The FBI will be on the case by now, and they really hate kidnappers. They have for years. You're not going to get away with holding me. They have technology you couldn't dream of. They'll find me, and you're toast. The bad words and attitude were back again. Sorry, sweetie. No deal. I want the ransom. I'm not your sweetheart, jerk. How many times do I have to tell you? Look, I'm trying to be reasonable here. You have zero chance of getting away with this. Absolutely none. The FBI's reputation is on the line because kidnapping is one of those federal crimes they pride themselves on solving every time. They throw everything they have into it. Let me go now, get out of town, hide somewhere remote, and you might, just might, stay ahead of the law. At least until you mess up again, which you probably will. Letting me go is the best option for both of us. I don't want to waste more time, and you have a chance to avoid the consequences of your crime. I shook my head. Still no deal, Miss Grayson. I want your father's money. That's the only way you're going back home. Think about it and get real, will you? I brought her another bucket of water to wash her clothes. She'd been wearing a sports bikini with a sturdy bra and shorts rather than underwear under her sweatshirt and running shorts. They were now piled on the floor, still soaked and smelling faintly of vomit. I took the new bucket in, locked up, and left her for a while. I made a jug of Gatorade, figuring she'd probably need the sugar and salts to replace what she'd lost from vomiting and skipping breakfast and lunch. I poured her a 16-ounce paper cup and took it in, almost forgetting my ski mask. That's when I taped a reminder note to my side of the door, stopped, and fixed the problem. My disguise was now securely over my head. I opened the door. Here's some Gatorade. I don't want you getting dehydrated. There's more in the jug if you want it. She hesitated. How do I know you haven't sedated it? I nodded, acknowledging her concern was valid, then took a long sip, about a quarter of the cup, making sure she saw me swallow twice. After that, I set the cup down on the floor. I hope you don't mind me drinking out of your cup, but it's the only way I can show you it's safe. I stepped back, giving her room to approach without coming within striking distance. I could tell she was tempted to throw the drink in my face, but I also knew that as soon as she smelled it, she would realize it was safe and drink it. Sure enough, she did, smacking her lips as she finished. I guessed her body was already thanking her for the salts and sugars, if not for the artificial colors and flavors. Want some more? I offered. She didn't say anything but extended her arm, so I could take the cup back like a waiter. I accepted, backed away, refilled it, and held it out to her. She didn't thank me, so I stayed silent as well. No point in making a big deal of that yet. There would be plenty of time to fix our relationship later, once she understood that, in truth, she didn't really have any choices. Funny thing about life, part of our training for handling detainees involved lectures on protecting your morale and sanity if you ever became a prisoner yourself. We were taught to observe and report on the mental state of those we guarded. One key point was to keep some emotional distance, making it clear to your captives that you would never be friends with them. That emotional barrier helped you remember there was nothing personal in the way they treated you, so you shouldn't take it personally or get offended. Treat it like the drill instructor's tough attitude in basic training and put it behind you. That was their advice. Using that knowledge, I realized Miss Grayson had just shown me she was used to being put down, so it would hurt her more when I didn't do as she demanded. She was realizing she wasn't in control here at all. In other words, she was vulnerable to conditions she'd never encountered before, and the more off balance I could keep her, the more likely she would comply with what I wanted. I picked up the empty bucket she'd washed her filthy clothes in, backed out, and locked the door behind me. For a moment, I unlocked my own bedroom door before entering. I put on a pair of disposable gloves that wouldn't leave fingerprints and grabbed my tray of writing materials, checking it over before reversing the process and re-entering her cell. She looked up, surprised I had returned so soon. Immediately, she was on the back foot, score one to me. Okay, Miss Grayson, let's start contacting your father. We both want you out of here. What I want you to do is pull out a sheet of paper from the pack and write exactly what I tell you. Then you'll address an envelope, peel off a postage stamp, stick it on, write your name only as the return address, and seal it. After that, you'll put the letter in this plastic bag so I can mail it without ever touching the envelope directly. I'm not going to make it easy for the FBI. If your father has been smart enough to call them, the last thing we want is a hostage rescue team showing up and a gunfight breaking out. People could get hurt, and we definitely don't want that. She tried to argue back. As I expected, she wasn't broken yet and would take a lot more to break her. Gunfight? You're all talk. A retired cop with a prosthetic leg could take you out easily. Geez, the leg could probably do it on its own, with its eyes closed. You'd probably wet yourself when you hear a police siren. You probably do that all the time anyway. How many defenseless little old ladies have you attacked from behind this week? That's probably as risky as your crimes get. Or are you still stealing candy from babies? her voice dripped with contempt. I ignored her. I knew from my training she was trying to rile me up to make me slip. This wasn't personal. You want to be released this century or next, she hissed, the sound more like an angry cat than a snake's warning. Then she stood, proud, body language full of contempt rather than hatred. That's fine, I thought. I could live with that. I wasn't about to ask her out on a date or meet her family anytime soon, was I? Okay, slimeball, she said. If you want a ransom note so I can get out of this flea pit, I'll write it. The sooner the better. I never want to see your miserable face or hear your whining again. I grinned. She was taking it personally, a mistake. She was letting emotions control her, reverting to childish insults. Thanks. Simple message to start. Tell him you've been kidnapped and your abductors want $250,000 in cash for your release. We'll look out for a red card in the courthouse window. When your father puts it up, we'll know he received the letter. Then we'll call him to arrange the ransom exchange, where we get the money, and he gets you back safely. Then you sign it, okay. $250,000? Geez, you must think a lot of yourself to ask that much. I smiled, and the scowl on her pretty face deepened. I decided to needle her a bit more. No, Miss Grayson, that's just the price I place on your freedom. If it was about your personal worth, your father couldn't afford what I'm asking. You arrogant scumbag, she spat. I guess she found that offensive. Tough, suck it up, baby. I'd found her father more than offensive, more than arrogant. The one-sided judgment he passed without ever meeting me or giving me a chance to respond was proof enough. She wrote quickly on the paper, short, angry strokes with the pen. I was surprised the paper didn't tear. Show me what you wrote, I said. She reluctantly handed it over. It was close enough to what I expected. No extra information that would help him find her. Just her opinion that my parents weren't legally married when I was born, that my IQ was low, and that my sexual orientation was unclear, not that she knew much about me or where she was now. She also claimed our town was full of dumb troublemakers, so that wouldn't help much. Okay, now fold it and put it in the envelope. Address it. Write your name on the back so they pay attention. Stamp it, then put it in this bag. Okay. I took the plastic bag with the letter from her hand and put it on the tray. Next, I want you to write down your father's personal cell number. I'm going to call him using a burner phone and then play him the message you're about to record. I typed a couple of messages on my computer, printed them out at the office, then permanently erased the files. I held out the first message. Read this out loud. If you want, add a personal message at the end. But if you try to give him a hint about your location, I won't play that part for him. Her eyes scanned the page, her scowl deepening. Then I held out my phone, and she read the words, her expression scornful but voice affectionate. Hi, Daddy. It's Laura. I'm okay, but a prisoner. My captors told me you put up the red card, which means you're gathering the ransom money. Use small bills. Once you've got it, replace the red card with a green one. You'll be contacted again with details on when and where to leave the money. After they check the ransom, I'll be released unharmed. Daddy, I hope you're recording this and that you find me real soon. I love you and Mom, and I'm sorry I stupidly got kidnapped by this poor white trash redneck. Can't wait to see you again. Hope it won't be long. Love you both. She stopped talking, and I ended the recording. I could live with being called a white trash redneck if that's how she wanted to underestimate me. That was just fine. Oh, and yeah, I can be a real jerk if I want to be. It's not who I usually am, but after the way Cassie had treated me, it was getting a whole lot easier to act like one. I might have been dumb but happy 5 months ago, but now, I certainly was not. Thank you, Miss Grayson. I just hope he's as sensible about this as you are. If he is, we'll get this resolved quickly. It's just a business transaction. We both want something from the other. If he doesn't make a fuss, you could be home in 4 or 5 days tops. Her face flushed with anger again. It seemed like the topic hit a nerve. She didn't want to feel like she was just a tool or a means to an end. If I'd been in her shoes, still damp, but no longer smelling bad, I'd be upset too. No one wants to be reduced to a mere piece in someone else's game. But I hoped I wouldn't show it so easily. She managed to hold back her temper before it exploded. Can I ask you a question? Go right ahead. You knew my name, so you must know who my daddy is. Why did you kidnap me in particular? Is it because of who your father is? Are you trying to get revenge because you were caught breaking the law and he was the one who had your miserable criminal case in his courtroom? Or are you just out of jail and still on parole? I laughed. Nice try, sweetie. You won't track me down that way. Actually, no. I've never laid eyes on him, nor he on me. He's one of the few people in town able to raise that kind of money, And with his contacts, I'm sure he can get it in untraceable used bills without the police knowing anything about it. Usual story. Follow the money to find the motive. But we're not that rich. I snorted in disbelief. The photo in the paper showed either a very well-to-do family or a successful con artist. $250,000 would be nothing to them in terms of net worth. The only obstacle was getting it in cash, in used bills, not gold bars under the bed, but he'd be able to raise the ransom easy enough. He knows the bank manager socially for sure, so a temporary mortgage for $250,000 wouldn't be a problem if he couldn't liquidate any assets at the moment. Don't sweat it. We'll do a deal in the end. I could have asked for a whole lot more, but I made him a fair offer. It's not exactly going to bankrupt you as a family, is it? She was thoughtful. I had pointed out a perfectly logical way for her family to raise the cash, and she couldn't fault it. I guess she hated the idea of being the cause of that kind of expense, though. I suspected that her college law degree would probably cost her father something similar, if not more, and she knew it. She might just have to delay law school a year or two until they replace the missing sum. I used her silence to take the tray holding the letter and my phone back into the other room. Then I picked up the camping mattress and pillow she had just earned herself. She would find out the hard way that the wooden floor of the cabin was pretty uncomfortable to sleep on, except that she'd had the sense to comply with my demand for a ransom note. We wouldn't get any reply for a few days, so she'd be sleeping over. Here's your bed. I'll bring the blankets back when they're properly dried. I guess she'd already discovered that the floor was hard and rough because she didn't make any objections. I took the blankets in and gave her her evening meal, 3 ham and lettuce rolls, some tomatoes, and 2 more bottles of water. The lights will stay on all night. I'm sure you can find a way to shade your eyes. Get some sleep. I'll bring you breakfast in the morning. She was silent. I didn't know exactly why. I suspected she might be afraid she wouldn't be sleeping alone. Or maybe she was just completely exhausted after the day's events. Or perhaps it was finally sinking in that she was a prisoner. I ate my own supper, wrote down a list of things I needed to do, checked that I'd locked up securely, and took myself off to my room. I'd had an even earlier start to my day than she had. I put the letter in its plastic bag on top of my bookcase. I wasn't planning to mail it anytime soon, but I thought I'd better keep it safe for now. Miss Grayson didn't need to know that part of my revenge on her father was making him go through the agonizing pain of not knowing where his daughter was. It had been a success. First day job done. I slept well. I wasn't feeling the slightest bit guilty about the girl in the other room. I had no idea how she was doing. I suspected she was pretty tired and that her body would shut down her mind in search of rest. I allowed myself a small, quiet laugh at the thought that her family might be wondering why she hadn't returned from her run. I had no idea about her social life, but I suspected the judge wouldn't be too happy about his daughter staying out overnight without telling him, not with his social standing in town. Again, I had no idea if she had a boyfriend. There hadn't been one in the newspaper photo, but that didn't mean there wasn't one. Well, I intended for the honorable judge to have plenty of sleepless nights worrying about his child. He owed me quite a few. I'm not ashamed to admit that I cried myself to sleep many nights, whenever I thought I might never see my little Allie again. Week 1, Day 2, Sunday. As usual, I was up and about soon after dawn. It looked like it was going to be another lovely day. I backed the truck into the barn so she couldn't see it and describe it later. Then I did a couple of hours of yard work, just enjoying being alive, before checking on my prisoner through the small opening in her door. She was still lying on the mattress. From her posture, I was pretty sure she was awake even if she wasn't moving around. With no windows and constant artificial light, she quickly lost any natural sense of time. I presumed she had slept some, not that it would bother me if she hadn't. But it was now breakfast time. She was in my power, and I did have an obligation to feed her. It was still too early in the year and too warm outside to want to have a fire burning in the chimney. Without a fire, I couldn't make toast. Yeah, I looked at buying a 12-volt toaster, but it would pull at least 13 amps, which was a little high for my DC system and wiring. You don't want to drain the battery too quickly. It doesn't help battery life to discharge too deeply or too often. Same reason I hadn't bought a 12-volt electric kettle or fry pan, even though, in theory, I could have used them off the truck electrics with the alternator running. I was planning to treat myself to a 12-volt crock pot come winter. It drew a little less power, and I might even be able to afford some more batteries to boost the bank's capacity. Of course, when Miss Grayson's ransom came through, I could probably go all out and connect to the electric grid, assuming the lawyers had left me enough money after I got my Allie back. I'd gotten used to buying prepackaged toast crackers from the store instead of real bread. They just about worked as an alternative if you didn't mind them being dry and brittle. They didn't go stale or moldy like bread does if you have to keep it outside the fridge for more than a couple of days. I opened a fresh pack of 8 slices for her and put ham, sliced cheese, chocolate spread, and jelly on 2 slices each. If she didn't like the choice, that was tough. An apple, a banana, and a mug of coffee completed her breakfast. I knew I'd have to watch the mug. It was a potential weapon. My bad for forgetting to pick up some more paper cups. I took the food into her cell, cursed under my breath for my trouble, locked her door again, then ate my own breakfast before making a final inspection outside. One thing the guy at the insurgent holding center had kept repeating was, keep checking your surroundings by examining them, as if you wanted to escape or hurt your guards. In other words, look at things from the bad guy's point of view. I walked the path we'd be taking, removing a couple of fallen branches that might have tripped me up if I was focused on her instead of where I was stepping. Satisfied that it was as clear as I could make it, I remembered that I had smoothed the ground a couple of months earlier when I'd driven the small digger down to improve the bathing hole. The hours I'd spent working with the gasoline string trimmer the previous week had paid off. There was a clear and obvious path, wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side. I went to fetch her, pulling on the ski mask before I unlocked her door and went in, keeping a very close eye on her body language and staying at a distance. I noticed she'd cleared the breakfast tray. That was a good sign. I reminded myself I couldn't trust her even the slightest bit. She had absolutely no reason to cooperate with me. She almost certainly hated me and would hurt me or worse if she got the chance. Honestly, I probably would feel the same if I were in her shoes. Miss Grayson, you need to wash your hair, so I'm going to let you bathe today. Please remember, this is a favor I'm granting you. It would be a lot easier for me to keep you using a bucket and a washcloth. If you mess me around or try to escape, then we'll do this again. So, I suggest you behave yourself. I could almost see her arguing with herself. As I suspected, the desire to be clean again was winning out over the immediate urge to escape. She wasn't stupid. She knew that she was getting a free pass to see outside her prison room, and I guess she hoped that might improve her chances of getting away later. Okay, I do need a bath. I suppose you haven't got any decent quality soap or shampoo? The contempt and disdain crept back into her voice. Okay, I could do that too. I picked up her breakfast tray and the mug, backed out of the door, and returned with a prepared cloth bag, showing it to her. None of your designer brands, sweetie. Just plain, ordinary, basic stuff, like what regular folks use. Soap, shampoo, washcloths, towels, and another clean shirt and shorts. You'll be carrying this bag in both arms. Keep to the path unless you want to get poison oak. I've got the ether pad in my pocket, and you really don't want to go through that awful vomiting stuff again. So don't try to get away from me. Got it? Yeah, whatever. I grinned at her attempt to be rude without crossing the line. She hadn't folded yet and was still looking for chances to push back. I hoped she was going to be a worthwhile adversary. If she'd just been a whining princess wasting valuable natural resources like oxygen, I'd already have been thinking about digging a deep hole with my shovel. Wouldn't have taken long. The dirt was easy going away from the tree roots, and I'm not boasting when I say my technique is nearly perfect, thanks to plenty of practice. Fortunately for her, she'd shown enough spirit the previous evening to keep things interesting. I'd have hated to go through the trouble of building a secure pin for her only to have to deal with her causing trouble immediately. Okay, come on out. She picked up the bag as she reached the door, came through the opening, and looked around the big room, seeing it for the first time. She'd been covered by a blanket on our way through the previous morning. What is this place? A cabin, I said. Yeah, I couldn't very well keep a beauty like you captive in a trailer park single-wide, could I? Sweetie, there'd be too many other guys wanting a piece of you once word got out there was a hottie about. She missed my sarcasm. I wasn't even sure she heard the comment, so focused was she on looking around my humble abode. I guess she'd probably never seen a normal cabin in real life. Maybe just some slave cabins and historical dramas on cable, or one of those living museum places. Otherwise, the closest she'd been was probably some upscale vacation cottage with all the towny facilities like a hot tub and sauna. She'd probably never been to a trailer park either and wouldn't have believed me if I told her that most park residents are decent, sociable people. She just assumed they were poor white trash. That was probably what her entire life experience shaped her to believe, given the society she mixed with and the rest of us she'd never encountered. Like I said, I had removed all obstacles and possible weapons from the path. There was a clear way to the outside, and I wanted to keep her moving. Walk on. Turn left out of the door. She walked ahead of me, following my instructions on the trimmed path, then kept going. The swimming hole was only 60 yards from the cabin, but the trees and undergrowth kept the creek hidden until she was almost on it. She stopped, turned around, angry and screaming at me. No way. No way. I am so not skinny dipping in a creek. You just want to get me naked and watch while you jerk off. You're a perv. I laughed. Have you never been to a beach and wrapped a towel around yourself to change clothes? The water is deep enough so you won't be showing anything, sweetie. I'd have thought a college party girl like you would be jumping at the chance to flaunt your body and tease me. She didn't like that answer and started ranting again, but I cut her off. Whoa there. Your hair still stinks of puke. Do you want to bathe or not? Make up your mind. She emptied the bag on the ground and grabbed the bath towel with a determined look. She wrapped it around herself and removed the sweats, carefully stepping into the water. She lifted the towel to keep it dry, turning away so her back was to me. She placed the towel on the bank's edge within reach from the water. Her movements were precise, revealing nothing more than her back and shoulders. She was fit and strong, her posture showing confidence and grace. Geez, this is cold. Okay, so it wasn't a heated pool, but this time of year it certainly wasn't unbearable. Back in December and January, when I'd been doing a little work on it while deciding the best way to tell Cassie and Ally that I'd bought them a week in the cabin to enjoy, the creek water had been cold. That had been part of the reason for not telling them until after I got back from Alaska. Ally would have wanted to try the water out and would have been very disappointed. You'll get used to it. It's going to be much worse when winter comes. You better hope your dad pays up before the cold sets in. I grinned. You know, I used to dream of this swimming hole when I was a kid in the sandbox, back when the water supply was pretty limited much of the time. Now I've got as much cool, fresh water as I want all to myself. A hole, she squeaked as she went deeper, annoyed with herself for showing a sign of weakness. I could still tell, from the way she held herself, that she was actually really pleased to be in fresh, clean water to have the chance to wash away the last traces of her ether-induced sickness. Even if she would have much preferred a shower with unlimited hot water like she was used to at home, and definitely not to be observed. I stepped back to give her a little more privacy. Even if she tried to run off now, the thick vegetation would obstruct her until I could grab her again. The obvious poison oak and the variety of brambles and thorns nearby would hopefully discourage any naked dash for freedom. She was smart enough to realize she had no idea where she was or which way to run. She was definitely taking her time. Maybe the water wasn't as cold as she expected, or maybe she was just testing my patience. Maybe she really did need that third rinse to wash away whatever scent still clung to her. The basic shampoo probably wasn't what she was used to, and there was no conditioner. Her light brown hair had looked nice in the newspaper photo, but now, wet and tangled, it didn't have the same effect. I'd included a comb in the bag so at least she could deal with the worst of the knots. I hadn't provided a mirror. Maybe I should consider it. Something polished metal, though nothing that could be broken or turned into a weapon. She made quite a show of reaching behind her for the towel without showing me too much, then got out of the water, dried off, and put on the clean shorts and shirt. I stayed well back, showing no great interest in admiring her, and eventually she just got on with it. The shorts were again way too large, but they did the job of covering her. I told her to repack the bag and then retrace her steps to the cabin. Just as I expected, when we got closer to the front of the cabin, she threw the bag at my head and bolted for the driveway. Dodging between the trees, I ducked away from the flying bag. Even while trying to hold up her loose-fitting shorts, she was fast, but she tripped over a cord I had hidden in the tall grass and went down with a startled cry. She tried to scramble to her feet, but I was quick, closing the distance. In moments, she struggled, but I pressed my knee into her back and secured her wrist behind her, pulling her to her feet. I grabbed hold of her damp hair and tilted her head up so she had to look at me. She gasped from the pain, her eyes locked on mine. Nice try, sweetie, but no cigar. Back in your room. She started shouting obscenities. I dragged her inside, pushed her down on the floor, and quickly checked her legs where she'd run into the cord. The skin was reddened in a line but not broken. That was why I'd used cord rather than wire. I rolled her onto her front and unlocked the handcuffs before jumping away from her and standing by the door. She lifted herself up and glared at me. That's one strike, Miss Grayson. Be very careful about number 2. I run a 3-strike Sanuroute establishment here. And trust me, wearing leg shackles 24/7 gets tiring real quick. She screamed more curses at me. I kept quiet, locked up, and left her to curse. I hoped she'd calm down and do some thinking about what had just happened. I'd shown her I wasn't going to take any nonsense from her. Okay, so I wasn't planning to follow through on my statement that she'd have to make do with a 3 or 4-gallon bath and a bucket for the rest of her captivity. I'd been forced to do that for a while earlier in the year, and I wouldn't willingly inflict that on anyone, even her. We'd already gone stir-crazy enough being cooped up like a flock of chickens, even though we had each other to grouse to. It would be a far worse experience in solitary. I went into town to buy more food and pick up some clothes in size 6 tall, 34B, without leaving a paper trail, and thought some more about whether keeping her alive was actually going to be worth all the trouble. Sunday was not a great day for clothes shopping. There were too many people around with nothing better to do than get in my way. I ended up with a couple of cheap Walmart t-shirts and a pair of leggings, but no questions about why a big guy like me was buying girls' clothing. I paid cash. I didn't speak as I pushed the paper sack containing her lunch into the room. If she didn't like a cold cheeseburger, fries, a large root beer, and an apple pie, then she could go hungry. I'd really enjoyed mine, though it had, of course, been half an hour fresher and hotter when I'd eaten it. Then I locked up again, drove over to the Hamilton construction office, and worked on my college assignment on my computer for 4 hours. I didn't spare my captive a thought until my stomach growled and I realized I needed to eat again, and therefore, so did she. That evening, her cardboard tray held 2 cartons of Chinese takeout from town and a plastic spoon to eat it with. If she was one of those people who didn't enjoy General Tso's chicken and egg fried rice, she was out of luck. I also pushed in the bag of clothes and half a dozen bottles of water, locked up again, and left her for the night, again without a word. Week 1, Day 3, Monday morning. I was awake well before she was, not difficult since she didn't have any windows to tell her the sun was up. I washed and dressed, slipped her bottled water and rations for the day, along with a fresh bucket of creek water for washing, through the door while she was still sleeping. Then I drove into town for a full breakfast at a small diner before going to work. I didn't get back to the cabin until 6. I checked around all my traps before looking through the spy hole, pulling on my ski mask, and opening up. She'd been lying on her mattress, but angrily got to her feet as I stood with my back to the wall. "Where the hell have you been?" I shrugged to show I didn't actually care what she thought. "At work." "Where else?" "Living costs money, and I need to earn it. I don't have a rich daddy to hand out cash whenever I fancy something. I just hope he's as keen to have you home as you are to get out of here, so we don't have to put up with each other much longer." Her face reddened when I mentioned her rich daddy, but her eyes flicked guiltily to the corner of the room by the privy, where I quickly spotted signs of activity. It didn't surprise me that she'd used the plastic knife and spoon to try to make a hole in the sheetrock wall. It was just as well I hadn't taken the trouble to paint it. I took a closer look. She hadn't yet gotten through the first layer, as the plastic had proved too flimsy. I decided to let her find out the hard way that I'd built them unconventionally. At the Insurgent Holding and Initial Interrogation Center, I learned a lot about using 3/4 expanded metal grid to prevent people from moving around. It was easily available from our local Home Depot in 4 by 8-foot sheets, and I'd planned the room layout to use them economically, so I didn't have to cut more than necessary. There was no way she was going to get through that stuff. Heck, they used it in the weapons cages at the armory because it was so resistant to attack. Even when she did expose a joint between the sheets, she wasn't going to be able to cut or break the heavy-gauge steel wire I'd painstakingly used to secure them together. The twisted ends were on the wrong side for her. I smiled at her. "Nice try, but if you want my advice, you're wasting your time and your fancy manicure trying to get through that mesh. If you're that bored, I could bring you some books." "Books? Are you sure you even know what a book is? Can you actually read?" I figured comic strips or picture books were more her speed. I grinned, exaggerating my accent to sound like a character from a TV show. "Tiny. My fault. I had to leave school at 9 to start work in the family shine business. Papa and my uncles were all in jail again. I'd knocked up Mama, 4 of my sisters, 2 aunts, and 6 cousins, and someone had to get food on the table. They said I'd have passed 3rd grade easy." Despite herself, she almost smiled at my reply. I guess she'd already been thinking I was only a redneck hick, and I just reinforced her prejudices. I didn't mind her underestimating me. It gave me an advantage. Look in the dictionary under idiot. My take is that the definition should include someone who badly underestimated the other guy. I posted the letter this morning. Your father should get it tomorrow if the USPS lives up to its promise. Then it's up to him to show good faith and get money together. In our town, that's going to take at least a couple of days unless he's got some suitcases full of banknotes hidden up in your attic already. You're going to be here for a while, and I don't want you to get cabin fever. I've got some paperback thrillers, airport books, you know. You're welcome to them. How about just letting me go instead? Sorry, Miss Grayson, that's not an option. Now that I've taken the risk of abducting you, I want some cash for my trouble. You're staying until he pays up? Goodwill has a shelf of books for sale. Any preference on authors? To my surprise, she thought for a moment and then told me she'd never heard of any of the 4 names she muttered. I tried to remember them so I could write them down once I got out of the room. Supper will be a few minutes, I said, quickly making a note of the authors she suggested and setting out her supper tray. I had bought some pre-prepared fruit and salad in plastic tubs and added some deli counter lemon mayo chicken slices on a paper plate. There was a carton of unsweetened cranberry juice to wash it down, and as an afterthought, I added a few of the pre-owned paperbacks I'd accumulated since returning. She didn't have to read them if she didn't want to. My guess was that her bedside bookcase and mine wouldn't have many titles in common, maybe just a Bible. That reminded me my ex had caused me to lose my childhood book collection. Most of it was just sentimental, but I'd had a few of my father's old westerns, some Zane Grey and Clarence Mulford early editions, which would be doubly hard to replace. There's something about reading an older copy of a classic book that you just don't get with a modern softback reprint, but the personal connection of knowing my dad had looked at the same pages was irreplaceable. That loss was another mark against her father who'd allowed it to happen. I'd been looking a little whenever I had some spare cash just in case any came up, but the bookstore in town didn't have much of a selection in pre-owned fiction. That didn't say much for the reading habits of the locals. Or maybe they kept the good books that were worth rereading and recycled the one time is enough rubbish. When I collected her tray, she ignored me, pretending to leave through one of the paperbacks, treating me like an invisible servant clearing up after her. That was fine. She'd find out soon enough that she needed human interaction. Until then, it made it easier for my conscience to imprison someone I knew almost nothing about. I was still unsure exactly what I was going to do about my upcoming National Guard drill weekend. Unless I drove home and back late at night and early in the morning, I was going to be away for Saturday night, say, 38 hours in all. She could possibly get up to some mischief in that time, but I still reckoned the room was pretty tough to escape from. One thing I was sure of, I wasn't going to tell her anything in advance. With that in mind, I decided I'd better build her up a reserve of drinking water just in case, for some reason, I couldn't get back. One evening, I put on my mask, checked the spa hole, and passed in her supper. I ate mine out on the porch, enjoying a peaceful beer and the quiet of the place after my day on the noisy construction site. Then I told her to give me her empties before I handed over a couple of smock dresses, a pair of slacks, some leggings, and a set of women's pajamas that I'd picked up at Goodwill at lunchtime. She didn't comment on the books I'd gotten for her. I hadn't been expecting thanks. I also gave her a plastic washing bowl that I figured would save me carrying 2 mini buckets of water. I wished her good night, locked up, and took myself off to bed. Tuesday was much the same. I filled up a couple more buckets from the creek first thing and took one in with her breakfast. I had another thought and gave her my battery-powered radio so she'd have company of a kind. She was listening to it when I took her evening meal in. She ignored me again, so I did the same to her. I took the empty water bucket and replaced it with a full one. When I took her supper in on Wednesday, I started some simple word games with her. I told her a lie that I'd driven past the courthouse and there was no red card up in the top window yet. She didn't reply, that was still absolutely fine with me. The silent treatment was a whole lot better than the earful from her screaming and cursing like a demented fishwife. Thursday evening, I continued the deception and told her there was still no red card in the window. Seriously, Miss Grayson, your father is not helping you get out of here as fast as you might. I suspect he's trying to buy time for the FBI, so we're going to have to wait until he decides to cooperate. As I thought she would, she broke her silence at last. I'm used to living and working alone, so mostly I'm enough company for me. I was pretty sure that most of her life she'd had people around her and had grown accustomed to talking. So, you got the feds on your tail. What's it like to live in fear? Yo? Won't be long now, and they'll have you on the floor with a gun in your ear. Or maybe you'll be bawling like a baby as they put the cuffs on you. Perhaps you'll get yourself hurt and be writhing around in agony while I laugh at you. They might even let me kick you a few times while you're resisting arrest. I grinned. Nah, you're going to be so disappointed on this, sweetie. I didn't leave any clues for them. They have absolutely no idea where you are. This is all going to work out just fine for me. All it's going to take is for your old man to get the cash together. Scumsucker. I'd been into a hardware store over lunch and spotted some self-adhesive plastic privacy film that had a pretty good reflective surface. I stuck a square of that on the wall of her bedroom so she'd have a mirror of sorts. She didn't comment, but I did notice when I went in later to collect her empties that her hair had been combed out and looked a whole lot better. Friday evening, I brought back a copy of the local paper and let her read it. There was no mention of her, something I checked carefully before handing it over, and yes, I told her the same lie about the red card. She had a question for me. I was a little surprised it hadn't occurred to her earlier. I need more batteries for the radio. Why can't I have my own iPod to listen to my music? Sorry, sweetie, you can track those things with GPS, so I left it where I picked you up, along with your fitness tracker. Boy, she didn't like learning that. Her facial expression turned even more hateful. You scumsucker. That had years of my favorite music on it. I shrugged my shoulders expressively to show that she'd have to accept this one too. I just couldn't take the risk of being tracked. Sweetie, you must have it all backed up on iCloud or iTunes, so when your daddy ransoms you, you can buy another device and reload it. Easy peasy. How many times do I have to tell you that I'm not your sweetie, you redneck loser a-hole? Thanks a lot. Pencil tool. It wouldn't have been any risk. They don't have GPS. You can only locate them when they're connected to the net. Don't you know anything? I grinned at her. Sweetie, I know enough to work out that 0.0 risk is a whole lot better than any risk at all. Just think how much more you'll appreciate it when you get another iPod. Do you want a pad of paper so you can work out which order you'll listen to your favorites once you get ransomed? That will help pass the time, be good mental exercise too. She cursed and threw a half-empty bottle of water at me, which I dodged. She was too angry to be accurate, and throwing is always more difficult from a sitting position. I waved my fingers teasingly at her as I backed through the door. She denigrated my character and even mocked the date on my parents' marriage certificate once again. It was lucky I didn't have thin skin. I might have been deeply hurt by some of the harsh things she said about me. I hadn't expected her to take to me, but she was downright hostile. Well, that wasn't my problem. As long as her father was suffering emotional pain over the unknown fate of his daughter, nothing else really mattered. I was smiling as I fell asleep. At least I was getting a bit of satisfaction from teasing her. I figured she had gone her own way in life more times than was good for her. She needed to learn the life lesson that sometimes things don't go your way, even if you're young, rich, well-connected, and beautiful. I supposed I was doing her a favor. After all, considering what you hear about this country these days, maybe it was a very necessary lesson. Remember that 16-year-old kid in Texas a few years back? The one who claimed he had a medical condition called affluenza and argued that because his parents had spoiled him all his life, he wasn't personally responsible for the 4 people he ran over while driving his dad's truck under the influence. Honestly, I would have loved to have that kid and his lawyers in my power for a few days, just to teach them that wealth doesn't always buy privilege. Actually, it was more like that lawyer deserved a serious reckoning. His defense went way beyond trying to lessen his client's responsibility. It crossed into the territory of denying the victims their rights, as if they were the ones who should have been punished. From what I read, he was a piece of work that couldn't be polished into anything worthwhile. You can't fix a person when they've gone that far wrong. How do these slick attorneys lose their moral compass so badly that they can argue something so fundamentally wrong and unfair? Maybe that's why lawyers often score so low in public opinion surveys. The few who grab all the headlines by stirring outrage outweigh the quiet majority who do good work. I got to know a couple of reserve officers in the Judge Advocate General's department during long night shifts at the Insurgent Detention Center. They were actually decent human beings. Until I received those papers from Judge Warren Cornell Grayson, I'd had a fairly positive view of the legal profession. Now, I'd rather shake hands with a politician or a car salesman. I'd still have to count my fingers afterward, but at least I'd know where they'd gone. Yeah, Republican or Democrat makes no difference. Our politicians are pretty much all in it for what they and their friends can get out of the taxpayer-funded gravy train, with maybe a very few honorable exceptions. My dad always said Ronald Reagan was the last completely straight president, someone who did no favors to anyone because he already had everything he wanted and was doing it just for the sake of it. I've seen the televised address he gave to the nation when the Challenger space shuttle exploded. In my opinion, it's the most sincere thing to come out of the White House since FDR's fireside chats. You could genuinely believe he meant those words, my fellow Americans. Okay, so he was a professional actor, but it was more than that. The man truly cared that, as a nation, we had tragically lost 7 great people, and he knew we were all grieving that loss. The current Congress? They don't see the world the way Reagan did. They just don't. It's two sides of the same coin, politicians and their cronies against the rest of us, who pay taxes so they can take from us. The next part of this story will be released soon. Please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.